Like you sit down and you go like, hey, I want to build a SharePoint app. Like I can just deploy it to SharePoint, right? Like maybe, but no, you probably have something else over here that you have to do. And I think that's the part that Microsoft doesn't teach their customers is like, it's not just you're doing, SharePoint development or Microsoft Teams development. You're kind of like building mini services on the side, and be they like web services or like service-based things, but you've got to deploy and run those. And what does that look like for you? And how do you rationalize that? And Microsoft has never been good at teaching anybody how to do that, be it partners, customers, whatever it is.
Yeah, you're spot on. And there's what you're saying. There's like two thoughts come to mind with this. One of them is a metaphor, an analogy that I'll do that in just a second. But I think that one of the things that when developers, so let me go back. One of the things that I started talking to developers about and trying to help them understand when I first started teaching the SharePoint framework stuff. One of the things that I saw as a bunch of the frustrations or challenges that people were having was that they were trying to take their servers, their old SharePoint baggage of doing server-side like farm-based solutions or sandbox solutions or add-ins, and they were trying to map all that stuff over to client-side dev. And it's like, okay, I get that you're going to do that to a certain degree, but really, I would try to coach people and just say, look, take a step back, leave your bags at the door, take a step back and look at what you're trying to solve. And can you do this exact same thing with just a web app? Can you build a React app or a SPA, a single page app? Can you build this and do the exact same thing? And if you can do that, when you're a developer and you run into a couple little roadblocks, or you're trying to figure something out, or you're hitting Stack Overflow, or now you're using something like ChatGPT and you're asking questions or going to the docs. And it was like, I can't figure out how to do this in SharePoint. I'm like, here's a pro tip. Drop the SharePoint word from your query and look for the exact same thing. Right, because you're going to find the universe of web developers outside of the universe of SharePoint developers is much bigger, and there's many more resources to it. So, like people are having trouble with React. I get this. Like, probably 50% of the questions that I get from my students is they're looking at something that is like, how do I do this in SharePoint? When like 50% of the time, it's like, this has nothing to do with SharePoint. This is a React question, or this has nothing to do with SharePoint. This is a TypeScript question. So drop the word SharePoint from all these different things, your search things that you're looking for, is you're going to find a lot more help out there, and it's going to be a lot more beneficial. And then building off of that, it's like, now think about this in another way, is that when you're building these different solutions, you should be thinking about them, or I think that you should be thinking about them first, not as a Teams app or as a SharePoint app as a developer, but I want to build this as a web app. My goal should be, I want to build this as something that could stand completely isolated from any of these other products, these other hosted products like Teams or SharePoint or whatever, or Viva. How do these other products then come into play then? The way that I look at these things, like Teams or SharePoint, right? Or in web, like say we have a web part in SharePoint. Let's say we're going to build like a little, I don't know, like a time. I want to submit for time off request, right? So I'm going to build a web part to do that. Okay, don't build a web part. Why don't you go build a React app that does that? Right? Now, there's parts of SharePoint where there is value that SharePoint's going to be providing, like the ability to have like the configuration settings on the web part that show up on the property pane, or in Teams, I have settings that are associated with it, or I want to be able to put it in a tab, or I want to install it as like a personal app. All of those things are just bridges between some host and your app. So when I build a SharePoint framework web part now, if I'm building it for my company, I'm building a React app, and then over in SharePoint, I'm going to build a SharePoint framework solution, but all that SharePoint framework solution does is it's simply going to load a React app and put it on the page, the React app that I built. It doesn't live in my SharePoint web part project. It lives in a separate package that I can easily import in. My SharePoint framework web part, his job is simply to go get those public properties from SharePoint and pass them in as public properties onto my React app. If I need any other kind of context stuff that SharePoint gives me or Teams gives me, like single sign-on or OAuth tokens for being able to call different web services, I pass those as inputs down into my React app. I don't give it an instance of the Microsoft Graph, or I don't give it an instance of some big client. I go through and get the data. I use just SharePoint to say, okay, or Teams, just go get my data and go hand that down to my React app to let him go do his work. And there's a lot of benefits to this. One of them, probably the most significant one, has to do with tooling, where you don't have this really opinionated infrastructure that you've got to deal with when you're building a Teams app or a SharePoint app. The only way that you can really build a SharePoint framework app today with any kind of productivity is to use the Yeoman generator for SharePoint that Microsoft provides. But it is such an opinionated project type that like setting up automated testing is a royal pain, right? Even ChatGPT is like, I don't have a clue. We're waiting for ChatGPT 7 on that one. Same with Teams. Like, I mean, Microsoft Teams, they come out with the community comes out with the Yeoman generator, but then, the Microsoft wanted to have their own version of it. So they wanted to have their own tooling. So they came out with the Teams toolkit. And it still is a very opinionated thing on how you have to end up building stuff, when that's really limiting on all the stuff that you can end up using your apps, or you can actually employing in your app and how you build your apps. So being able to have unit testing and use the best tools that are available to you for building that stuff, or using the latest version of React, or using different UI libraries. You don't have to sit there and use everything that Microsoft is giving you. And in fact, a lot of times, you think about it, the stuff they're giving you is the stuff they use to build their apps, and that may not be the best thing for you. So it's kind of funny because like I do a workshop at conferences about the SharePoint framework, a full day workshop, and I teach the way Microsoft kind of pushes it because that's where most of the docs are and everything are. But depending on my audience, to see like how kind of switched on or how advanced they are. Or I guess if they're looking for more like if they're more on the green side, kind of take their temperature and I kind of feel the room and be like, all right, are people like interested in this kind of a topic? And so what I'll end up doing is, like I did this recently at a conference in Washington D.C., the 365 EduCon conference, and I talked about this whole thing of just build web apps, and you see people like going, well, wait a minute, how does this work and how does this work? And I start asking a lot more questions. You kind of explain to them, and all of a sudden you start seeing some of these developers like, seriously, I'm like, yeah, it's not. This isn't rocket science. Like seriously, you know what a SharePoint framework web part is? It does two things. If you're building a React app, if it lives in SharePoint, or if it lives in your SharePoint framework project, or it lives out of it, all the SharePoint framework does is it adds a div on the page, and then it loads your React application. Either it's in the SharePoint framework project or elsewhere, and it just simply says, take this React app and render it into this div. Done. That's it. It's like, there's no other magic associated with it. And Teams is basically this. Teams is even simpler because everything is basically done in an iframe. Yeah. So
it's been a weird thing though. It's not well socialized, right? I think when you sit down and you think about these things, like the impression I get when I talk to folks is they still think about it as kind of a monolithic stack, right? Like where I'm doing SharePoint or I'm doing Teams. Like I was having a conversation with somebody the other day about like chatbots in Teams, and hey, let's just build a new chatbot and have it sit over here. Like, okay. Well, what's that mean? Well, it means you need a service that you can pass these prompts to and have it respond and do these things. And that service in the middle, like the middleware is your secret sauce, and you need to go build that middleware and put it together and host it and figure out what it is. And they just kind of fall apart at that step sometimes. So like, oh, great, now I'm outside the stack. Like, well, sure, but I think I'm with you. Like that brings flexibility. Like I have a lot of conversations as well with like Azure customers. We're like, oh, I can't do like blah 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 in the PowerShell commandlet the way I want to. I'm like, great, we have a REST API. Here's the invoke AZ REST method commandlet. Like have fun, have at it. Oh, I don't know what REST is and how to do it. It's like, it's just an endpoint. Like you call it and you do things. Or I do a lot of stuff like with our service teams around like ADO automation and using like the ADO analytics APIs and just the raw REST APIs. And they're like, you can do that? I'm like, sure. Like, yesterday I was building out like just OData queries in an Excel workbook for somebody, and they're like, whoa, like how'd you, like, I hit next, and it all just kind of worked. It's okay.
It's funny you say that, because that's like, I see that a lot with people, with web developers as well, where they think like, I have to use this SDK from Microsoft to talk to the graph, or I have to use the PMP.js SDK from the community to be able to talk to the SharePoint REST API. I'm like, you don't. I mean, you can, and I'm not saying that there's bad things associated with those, but like the story that you just told a second ago is more like I traditionally only go to the REST endpoints for stuff. I don't use SDKs, because I find that, I mean, if you look and see that, oh, do you have a REST endpoint? You don't have to look for anything else. If a company's got a REST endpoint, which every SDK ends up being built off of and talks to, you have a REST endpoint, then you can just talk directly to that and not have to worry about all the other, try and figure out what somebody else's interpretation of that endpoint is through the SDK that they built. And I mean, it's like the Microsoft Graph. You know how to read the docs and understand how the REST endpoint works, or if you know how to use a REST endpoint and essentially ask it what its specs are, you don't need anything else to try and read some other docs to try and build this, to build it out. And so I'm like, oh yeah, we have this problem with the Microsoft Graph SDK, or I don't like this, how the Fluent Fluent API works, and how you just constantly like do ... to try and add on more and more methods to your queries. It's like, just use the REST API. You can use the REST API with that.